Imagine standing at the bow of a ship. Not a modern vessel with its humming engines and glowing instrument panels and satellite uplinks that can locate you within 3 meters anywhere on Earth. But a real ship, a wooden ship, a ship built from timber felled in some forest a continent away, assembled by men who hammered iron nails by hand and coiled rope made from plant fibre and cured animal hide. You're standing at the bow of this ship, and when you look out at the ocean in front of you, you see nothing. You see the same thing you would see if you turned around or looked left or looked right. You see only water, water reaching to the curved edge of the horizon in every direction, an unbroken circle of grey and green and deep cold blue, and above it the sky, and between the sky and the water, nothing else, nothing at all, for hundreds, possibly thousands of miles. This was the reality of maritime life for more than 4,000 years of recorded human history. From the first Phoenician traders who coasted carefully along the rim of the Mediterranean, to the Norse longship captains who pointed their dragon-proud vessels into the grey North Atlantic, to the Spanish galleon masters who crossed the Pacific with holds full of silver and silk, every single one of them faced the same fundamental truth that the sea imposes on all who sail it. Once you leave sight of land, you are entirely on your own. There is no calling for help. There is no rescue service waiting on standby. There is no way to send a message that will arrive faster than the physical movement of another ship, and another ship might be a week away, or a month away, or simply nowhere near you at all. If something goes wrong, if the mast cracks, if the hull springs a leak, if the food runs out, if a fever begins moving through the crew, then whatever you have with you, whatever knowledge is inside the heads of the men and women aboard, whatever tools and stores and experience you carry, that is the totality of what stands between you and the deep water beneath your keel. It is almost impossible for a person in the modern world to fully grasp what this meant in practice. We live in an age so saturated with connectivity, so webbed and threaded with invisible signals bouncing between towers and satellites and undersea cables, that true isolation is almost a theoretical concept for most people. We worry about losing cell service for a few hours. We feel vaguely anxious when a flight goes out of Wi-Fi range. The idea of being genuinely, absolutely, unreachably cut off from all other human beings, and not for hours but for weeks or months, sits beyond the comfortable edges of our imagination. But it was not beyond the imagination of the men who sailed the tall ships. They knew exactly what it meant. They had seen it happen to others. They had sometimes survived it themselves. And they went to sea anyway, because the sea was the highway of the world, and the world's business had to be done, and whoever mastered the ocean mastered everything that moved across it. Spices, slaves, gold, wool, ideas, armies, empires. The sea was not a place to avoid. It was a place to conquer, and the cost of that conquest, paid out over centuries in lives and ships and untold suffering, was simply the price of doing business in the age before the world was fully mapped and fully wired. What follows is the story of what happens when ships are caught by weather, by ice, by fire, by disease, by the simple mechanical failure of wood and rope and canvas, caught far from any shore, far from any help, far from any witness. These are not fairy tales. These are not adventure stories dressed up for easy consumption. These are accounts drawn from ship's logs and court testimonies, and survivor memoirs, and the careful work of historians who have spent their careers sifting through the archival evidence of maritime catastrophe. Some of these stories end in rescue. Some end in tragedy. Some end in silence, in the complete and permanent disappearance of a vessel and everyone aboard, leaving behind nothing but a blank space in the shipping records and an entry in some harbour master's ledger, noting that the ship was expected on such and such a date and never arrived. We begin at the beginning, not at any single catastrophe, but at the ocean itself, which was the original condition that made all of these stories possible. To understand what it meant when a ship was stuck, you first need to understand what a ship was. Not in the abstract, not as a symbol of adventure or exploration, but as a physical object, a machine made of organic materials, governed by the laws of physics and biology and decay, sent out onto an environment that was actively hostile to everything it was made of. A sailing ship of the classical age, and by classical age we can mean anything from the great Egyptian reed boats of 3,000 years before Christ, to the full-rigged square-sailed vessels of the 18th century, was fundamentally a collection of cut timber held together by metal fasteners and rope, made watertight by forcing fibrous caulking material into the gaps between planks and then coating everything in tar and pitch, and driven forward by the controlled capture of moving air in fabric stretched between wooden spars. Every single component of this machine was in a continuous state of slow deterioration. The wood was always trying to rot, the rope was always trying to fray, the fabric of the sails was always weakening under the combined assault of ultraviolet radiation, salt spray, and the mechanical stress of filling with wind. The iron fasteners were always rusting, the caulking was always working loose. A ship was not a static object, it was a dynamic system fighting a constant battle against entropy, and the people who crewed it were, in large part, fighting that battle alongside it, caulking seams, tarring, rigging, splicing rope, mending sails, pumping out the water that found its way in through the thousand small compromises of the hull. The deeper you go into understanding how these ships actually worked, the more remarkable it becomes that they functioned at all. Consider the rigging of a major three-masted ship of the line from the 18th century, the kind of vessel that fought at Trafalgar or rounded Cape Horn on its way to the Pacific. Such a ship might carry 3 miles of standing rigging, the fixed ropes that held the mast in place, plus miles more of running rigging, the ropes that controlled the angle and shape of the sails. There were hundreds of individual lines, each one with a specific name and a specific purpose, and a ship's crew was expected to know all of them by feel in complete darkness, because battles and emergencies did not pause to wait for daylight and clear weather. The men who crewed these ships trained for years simply to operate the machine that carried them, and even then, even with a full and experienced crew in perfect weather, things went wrong constantly. Now imagine what happened when things went wrong 1,000 miles from the nearest port. The career of Sir Francis Drake, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, completing his voyage in 1580, illustrates almost every category of maritime crisis that could befall a ship in the age of sail. Drake left Plymouth in December of 1577 with 5 ships and a crew of roughly 164 men. By the time he returned nearly 3 years later, he arrived with a single ship and 59 men. 4 ships and more than 100 people had been swallowed by the voyage. Some were lost to storms, some were scuttled, deliberately sunk, because Drake didn't have enough crew left to sail them. One captain was executed for what Drake described as insubordination. The voyage that history remembers as a triumph of navigation and English daring was, from the perspective of the men who sailed it, a grinding 3-year exercise in survival against the constant threat of catastrophe. Drake was exceptional. He was a navigator of rare skill, a leader of fierce authority, and a man with the particular quality that all long voyage captains needed above everything else: the ability to make decisions under pressure with incomplete information and then commit to those decisions absolutely, because hesitation and second-guessing were luxuries that the sea did not allow. But even Drake, with all his skill and authority, could not fully control what happened when his ships were thousands of miles from any source of help. The ordinary reality of life aboard a sailing ship was shaped by a hierarchy so rigid and so deeply encoded in law and custom that it sometimes seems almost incomprehensible from a modern perspective. At the top was the captain, whose authority at sea was essentially absolute. He had the legal power of life and death over every person aboard, and this was not metaphorical. He could order a man flogged. He could order a man hanged. In extreme circumstances, he could order a man marooned, left on a coast or island with whatever the captain's mercy provided, which might be nothing at all. Below the captain was the first lieutenant or first mate, who ran the day-to-day operation of the ship. Below that was a hierarchy of officers and specialists: the sailing master, who handled navigation, the boatswain, who maintained the rigging, the carpenter, who maintained the hull, the cook, the surgeon, the purser, who tracked the supplies. And below all of them were the ordinary sailors, the hands, who worked in 4-hour watches around the clock, who slept in hammocks in the darkness of the lower decks, who ate whatever the purser issued and drank whatever water the barrel still held. This was the world that a ship at sea consisted of. It was a small, closed, hierarchical, intensely social world, and it moved through an environment of extraordinary scale and indifference. The Atlantic Ocean covers roughly 41 million square miles. A ship sailing across it occupied, at any given moment, perhaps 1/4 of an acre of its surface. The mathematics of rescue, even assuming another ship was looking for you, which it usually wasn't, were essentially the mathematics of finding a single match floating in a lake. When disaster struck at sea, it came in several characteristic forms, and each of them had its own particular psychology, its own particular arc of suffering. There was the sudden catastrophe, the reef encountered in darkness, the squall that hit before the sails could be reduced, the lightning strike that ignited the powder magazine. These were fast and final. They didn't give the crew much time to think, but then there were the slow catastrophes, the kinds of emergencies that unfolded over days and weeks, that gave everyone aboard plenty of time to understand exactly what was happening to them and to contemplate what it might mean. These were the ones that tested something deeper than seamanship. These were the ones that tested what human beings are made of, at their absolute core, when the comfortable scaffolding of civilization is stripped away, and there is nothing left but the ship, the sea, and the question of whether anyone will survive. The provisioning of a ship for a long voyage was an exercise in careful calculation that could, and often did, become a matter of life and death months later. The purser, the officer responsible for managing the ship's stores, worked from tables that specified daily rations for each member of the crew. So many pounds of biscuit, so many ounces of salt meat, so many pints of beer or watered spirits, so much dried peas or oatmeal or cheese. These calculations were based on known voyage durations, which were themselves based on historical averages of sailing times and averages by definition built in the expectation of some voyages taking longer than the average. But the margin between the average and the catastrophic was thinner than anyone liked to admit. Ship's biscuit, hardtack, the basic staple of the seafarer's diet for centuries, was made from flour and water, baked until it was hard as stone, and packed into barrels or bags where it could theoretically keep for years. In practice, it kept for considerably less than that. The weevils found it, and the moisture found it, and within weeks of leaving port, a ship's biscuit supply was typically alive with insects and spotted with the greenish-black mould that grew wherever the baking had been imperfect. Sailors ate the biscuit anyway. They had no alternative. They ate it in the dark because eating in the light meant watching what you were eating, and watching what you were eating had a measurable effect on the amount that sailors were willing to put in their mouths. Salt meat was the other pillar of the maritime diet. Beef, or pork packed in heavy brine in wooden barrels, preserved by the salt against the spoilage that the tropical heat would otherwise cause within days. The salt that preserved the meat also, over time, made it almost inedible to anyone without the specific constitution of a long voyage sailor. The meat was soaked before cooking to remove some of the salt, but it was never fully rehabilitated from its months in the barrel, and the texture and smell of it after a long voyage were things that returned sailors described with an involuntary shudder, even in the comfort of shore life years later. The brine that the meat was packed in was also used on some ships to preserve the fresh vegetables that were loaded at the start of the voyage, onions, turnips, cabbages, and these vegetables deteriorated even faster than the meat, because the barrel processing that preserved the meat was not designed for them, and within weeks they had disintegrated into a brown, salt-saturated mush that provided some nutrition but required a strong stomach. The question of fresh water was perhaps the most fundamental of all the provisioning problems, because unlike food, where the body could tolerate gradual deterioration in quality for extended periods, water could not be replaced by anything else, and the deterioration of the water supply was both faster and more treacherous. Water stored in wooden barrels absorbed the flavour of the wood, particularly when the barrels had previously held wine or spirits, which was common because the same coopers who made wine barrels made water barrels and often used the same stock, and it absorbed whatever microscopic life was present in the environment. A barrel of water that had been stored for 6 weeks in the bilge of a ship in tropical waters was, by any modern understanding, a culture medium for multiple species of bacteria, and the sailors who drank from it were essentially inoculating themselves with whatever those bacteria produced. That they survived at all is a testament to the resilience of the human digestive system. That they often did not survive is an equally significant testament to its limits. Navigation in the age before GPS was a discipline that combined precise mathematical calculation with a great deal of informed guesswork, and the quality of both varied enormously among the captains who practiced it. The fundamental problem was longitude, knowing not just how far north or south you were, which could be determined by measuring the angle of the sun or certain stars above the horizon, but how far east or west, which required knowing exactly what time it was at a reference location. The clock that could keep accurate time at sea, compensating for the motion of the ship, the changes in temperature and humidity, the vibration of the hull, was not available until John Harrison completed his marine chronometer in the 1760s, and even then it took decades for accurate chronometers to become standard equipment on commercial vessels. Until they did, navigators calculated their longitude by dead reckoning, tracking their speed and direction from a known position, and estimating where they were based on how far they had travelled since they last knew for certain. Dead reckoning accumulated errors. Every imprecision in the speed measurement, every miscalculation of the current's effect on the ship's track, every compass error, every night of overcast sky that prevented star sights. Each of these contributed a small increment of uncertainty to the ship's estimated position, and those increments added up over a long voyage until a ship that thought it was 50 miles from a coast might in fact be 20 miles from it, or 5, or already past the outer shoals and among the rocks. The navigational history of the Age of Sail is full of ships that ran aground confidently, ships whose captains had done everything correctly by the standards of their time and were still, in the end, wrong about where they were. This navigational uncertainty added a particular dimension to the problem of being stuck at sea. When a ship was becalmed, or trapped by ice, or disabled by storm damage, the question of where exactly it was, and therefore how far it was from any possible destination or rescue, was itself uncertain. The captain of a becalmed ship in the doldrums knew approximately where he was. He knew it within a range of uncertainty that might be 50 miles or 100 miles or more, depending on how recently he had been able to take a sun sight and how accurately he had tracked his progress since then. And this uncertainty was not a minor consideration. 100 miles of uncertainty in the Age of Sail could be the difference between a ship on a manageable route and a ship on a route that put it on a lee shore, a coastline directly downwind, at the worst possible moment. There is a line in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient, Mariner, published in 1798, that has lodged itself so deeply in the English language that millions of people use it, without knowing where it comes from. Water. Water. Everywhere. Nor any drop to drink. The line describes one of the most terrible situations a sailor could face. Stranded in the open ocean, surrounded by salt water, dying of thirst. But the full poem describes something even more specific and more terrible, something that was not a poetic invention but a documented phenomenon that sailors of the age dreaded, as much as storms and fire and ice. It describes a ship that cannot move. Coleridge wrote his poem drawing on the published accounts of real voyages, particularly the narrative of George Shelvockier, whose ship the Speedwell sailed through the South Seas in the early 18th century, and became, at various points, completely motionless on a windless sea. He also drew on conversations with William Wales, who had sailed with Captain Cook on his second voyage to the Pacific, and who described to Coleridge in vivid detail what it was like when the wind failed for days at a time in the open ocean. Coleridge was a poet, and he transformed these accounts into one of the greatest works in the English language, but the nightmare at the heart of his poem was borrowed from real life, the doldrums. The word itself is one of those perfectly expressive pieces of English that feels like it means exactly what it describes. The doldrums is the informal name for a meteorological region of the tropical ocean, centred roughly along the equator, where the trade winds from the north and south meet and cancel each other out, creating a zone of persistent low pressure, light and variable winds, and what sailors call calms, periods of dead, absolute windlessness that could last for hours, or days, or sometimes weeks. A sailing ship in the doldrums was a prisoner. Without wind to fill its sails, it was simply a floating wooden box drifting at the mercy of whatever ocean currents happened to be moving through the area, which in the doldrums was typically very little. The formal name for the doldrums among meteorologists and oceanographers is the Intertropical Convergence Zone, and its location and severity shift with the seasons. Spanish sailors who crossed the Atlantic regularly in the 16th and 17th centuries called it the horse latitudes, a name that has been explained several different ways. One popular theory holds that when water ran low on ships carrying horses to the New World, the animals were thrown overboard to conserve drinking water for the crew. Whether or not that specific story is true, the name captures something of the desperation that the windless zones could produce. What actually happened to a ship that was becalmed for an extended period was a slow accumulation of crises, each one feeding the next. The most immediate problem was practical. Without wind, no progress was made toward any destination, and a ship that made no progress consumed its stores without replenishing them. Every day at anchor on a windless sea was another day's worth of food and water, consumed without any corresponding advance toward port. On long ocean passages, crossing the Pacific from the Philippines to Mexico, for example, which was one of the most demanding regular trades in the 17th century, the provisioning of a ship was calculated with margins that were thin to begin with. An unexpected 2-week calm could eliminate those margins entirely and push the crew into genuine starvation territory. The second problem was water. Fresh water was stored in barrels, and barrels were never perfectly sealed, and the wood they were made of was always subject to contamination. Water went bad on long voyages. It turned green and slimy and smelled of rot, and drinking it caused illness, but not drinking it caused death, so the crew drank it anyway. In the tropics, where the doldrums are found, the rate of water consumption increased because the heat was intense and the physical labour of sailing a ship was constant. A calm in the tropics was, in terms of water consumption, the worst possible place for a ship to stop moving. Then there was the heat itself. The sun in the intertropical convergence zone is directly overhead and merciless. A wooden ship baking under equatorial sun, with no wind to create even a breath of cooling air, became something close to an oven. The tar and pitch that sealed the deck seams softened and ran. The standing rigging, the fixed ropes that held the masts in place, went slack as the hemp fibres expanded in the heat and humidity. Below decks, where the crew lived and slept, the temperature became almost unendurable. The stench of the lower decks on a becalmed tropical ship, unwashed bodies, salt-soaked clothing, rotting food, the bilge water that sloshed in the very bottom of the hull, was something that veteran sailors described with a particular kind of eloquence in their journals, the eloquence of someone who has endured something so specific and so awful that only direct description can convey it. But perhaps worst of all was what the calm did to the mind. Sailing ships in the age before radio operated on the assumption of constant motion. The whole system of watches and duties and navigation was organised around the idea that the ship was always going somewhere, always making progress, always working through the miles toward a destination. A calm broke this rhythm entirely. There was nothing to do. The sails hung limp and useless. The wheel needed no one to hold it. The officers paced the deck and squinted at the horizon, looking for any ripple on the water that might indicate a coming wind, and found nothing, day after day. The ordinary sailors, with no work to occupy them, had nothing to do but think about the water in the barrels, about the food in the hold, about the distance to the nearest land, about the men they'd heard of who had died in calms just like this one. One of the most harrowing accounts of extended becalming in maritime history comes from the logbook of the French ship St. Louis, which crossed the Atlantic in 1738 and became trapped in a windless zone for 22 days in late summer, somewhere in the vicinity of what is now the mid-Atlantic. The captain, a naval officer named Jean-Baptiste Dubois, kept meticulous records during the entire ordeal, and those records have survived in the French naval archives. By the 7th day, he notes that the water ration had been halved. By the 12th day, 2 men had died, one from what Dubois records as heat fever, which likely means heat stroke, and one from what he describes only as despair, which is a word that appears in ship's logs more often than is comfortable to read. By the 18th day, Dubois writes in his log that several of the sailors had begun to show signs of what he calls disordered reason, hallucinations most likely brought on by a combination of severe dehydration, heat, and the psychological strain of prolonged helplessness. The St. Louis eventually found its wind on the 22nd day and limped into Martinique 9 days later, with a crew that had lost 7 men and been pushed to the edge of dissolution. Dubois' account is notable for its clinical precision and for the way it traces day by day the escalating pressure that a simple absence of wind applied to everyone aboard. It is not a dramatic account. It is a quiet one, the quiet of a man carefully recording the slow deterioration of his situation, and hoping, perhaps, that someone might eventually read it and understand what it meant to be truly, completely, helplessly stuck in the middle of the ocean with nothing to do but wait. Coleridge captured this helplessness in his poem with an image that has become one of the most famous in English literature, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. It is a description of a ship that has become, in its stillness, something unreal, something belonging to the decorative world of paint and canvas, rather than the actual world of salt and wind and wood. A ship without motion is, in some fundamental sense, no longer quite a ship. It has become merely an object floating on the surface of a sea that no longer cares about it at all. The experience of being becalmed was, for many sailors, the clearest possible demonstration of a principle that the sea enforced on everyone who worked it, that the relationship between human effort and outcome was, at best, indirect. On land, in most circumstances, working harder produces more results. If you need to go somewhere, you walk faster, or you hire a horse, or you build a road. Human will has some direct relationship with human movement, but at sea, in a calm human will, was completely disconnected from the ship's movement. You could work every man in the crew until they dropped. You could pile on more sail than the mast could safely bear. You could pray, you could curse, and the ship would not move, because the ship moved by wind, and there was no wind, and no effort on the part of any human being could change that fact. This powerlessness in the face of the natural world was for many sailors not new information. They had accepted it intellectually before they ever went to sea, because the sea was a place where everyone understood that the weather was in charge. But there is a significant difference between knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally, day after day, while the water barrels got lighter, and the food barrels got emptier, and the men around you got quieter and more desperate. The philosophical acceptance of powerlessness is one thing. The lived experience of it, measured out in days of motionless heat and diminishing rations, is another thing entirely. Sailors developed elaborate rituals and superstitions around the wind, many of them designed to encourage its return during calms. The practice of whistling for wind, which is now remembered as a maritime superstition with no particular significance, was, in the context of a ship becalmed in the tropics, a genuinely practiced ritual performed by sailors who understood perfectly well that it probably did not work, but who found the act of doing something, anything, preferable to the psychological torture of doing nothing. Some traditions held that certain actions would bring wind, tying a specific knot in the rigging, throwing coins into the sea, making particular offerings, or invoking particular saints. Other traditions held that certain actions would cause wind to leave, and these were strictly avoided. Whistling in the normal course of things was forbidden on many ships, reserved only for the ritual summoning during calms, because the superstition held that casual whistling would bring too much wind, or the wrong kind of wind, or disturb the careful balance of the weather. If the doldrums represented one extreme of maritime immobility, the absolute stillness of the windless tropics, then the Arctic represented its mirror image, a ship imprisoned not by the absence of wind, but by the presence of ice. Where the becalmed ship waited in heat and silence, the ice-trapped ship waited in cold and darkness. Where the crew of a tropical calm consumed their water in the heat, the crew of an Arctic winter watched the sea itself freeze around them. And where the becalmed ship might eventually be freed by a shift in the weather, the ice-trapped ship faced the possibility that the ice might never release it, that the ship and everyone aboard might simply become permanent features of a landscape that no one would ever visit again. No story in the history of maritime disaster captures this particular form of entrapment as completely, as heartbreakingly, or as enduringly as the story of the Franklin expedition, the British naval expedition that sailed in May of 1845 with the ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror under the command of Sir John Franklin, with the mission of finally completing the Northwest Passage through the Arctic archipelago of northern Canada. It was one of the best equipped expeditions in British naval history, and it disappeared completely. For a century and a half, the final months of Erebus and Terror were among the great unsolved mysteries of the sea. To understand the scale of what Franklin's expedition attempted, it helps to understand what the Northwest Passage was and why it mattered so obsessively to the British Empire in the mid-19th century. The Passage, a navigable sea route through the maze of islands and channels that fill the Arctic waters north of the North American continent, had been the holy grail of northern exploration for 300 years by the time Franklin sailed. If it existed, and if it could be reliably navigated, it would provide a dramatically shorter route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, eliminating the need to sail all the way around the southern tips of either Africa or South America. The economic implications were obvious and enormous. The military implications were equally significant. And there was, beyond all practical considerations, the simple matter of national prestige. Britain was the world's dominant naval power, the mistress of the seas, and the idea that there was a major maritime route she had not yet charted and controlled was intolerable. Franklin's expedition had tried before, in 1819 and 1825, and had reached deep into the Arctic on both occasions without completing the passage. By 1845, he was 59 years old, elderly by the standards of Arctic exploration, and had spent most of his career serving the Empire in various capacities, including a disastrous 3 years as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, from which he'd been recalled in circumstances that were politely described as administrative difficulties and rather less politely described by his enemies as incompetence. The 1845 Arctic expedition was Franklin's chance to redeem himself, to add his name to the list of great British explorers, to find the passage that had eluded every previous attempt. Erebus and Terror were, by the standards of the time, extraordinarily well equipped. Both ships had been reinforced for Arctic service, their hulls strengthened with iron plating and additional internal bracing to resist the crushing pressure of sea ice. Both carried steam engines, a relatively new technology for naval vessels, that could drive them forward under their own power when there was no wind or when manoeuvrability around ice floes was required. They carried enough food, in newly developed tin canning, that the Navy was experimenting with, to last 3 years. They had a small library of books, they had heating systems, they had a photographic darkroom. By any measure available in 1845, these ships were ready for what they were about to face. What they were not ready for, what no one was ready for because no one had ever fully experienced it, was the particular combination of circumstances that would ultimately destroy them. The winter of 1845 to 1846 in the Arctic was severe, and Erebus and Terror became locked in the ice on Beechey Island in what is now Nunavut, Canada, forcing them to overwinter. 3 men died during that first winter. Their graves, discovered in 1850, are among the most haunting artifacts of the expedition. 3 stone cairns on the barren gravel of Beechey Island in the Canadian high Arctic, still visited by the occasional ship today. But 3 deaths in a winter camp was not catastrophic. The expedition had the provisions to sustain losses. In the spring of 1846, when the ice opened sufficiently, the ship sailed south and west, making progress toward the passage, and then they got stuck again. In September of 1846, somewhere off the northwest coast of King William Island, the ice closed around both ships and did not let go. Not for the winter, not for the following spring, not for the following summer. The ice held Erebus and Terror for 19 months. The men aboard, there were 129 of them, spent those months in conditions that can only be described as a slow, grinding, multi-front assault on the human body and the human mind. The Arctic winter in those latitudes means roughly 4 months, in which the sun does not rise above the horizon at all. Complete darkness, broken only by moonlight, starlight, and the green curtains of the aurora borealis rippling overhead. Temperatures dropped to 50 or 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The ships, despite their heating systems, were bitterly cold below decks. Outside, the wind drove the cold through every layer of clothing available. Sir John Franklin died aboard HMS Erebus on the 11th of June 1847, of what cause the records do not clearly say, though the leading theory among historians is a combination of illness and the general physical deterioration that prolonged Arctic entrapment caused in even the strongest men. His death left the expedition under the command of Captain Francis Rawdon, Moira Crozier of the Terror, a man of considerable experience and considerable competence, who now faced the task of making the hardest decision of his life. In April of 1848, Crozier made that decision. He ordered the abandonment of the ships. The surviving men, 105 of them, reduced from 129 by 24 deaths, took to the ice on foot, dragging heavy sledges loaded with supplies and equipment, and began walking south toward the Canadian mainland, which was at least 300 miles away across some of the most brutally inhospitable terrain on Earth. What happened to them after that has been pieced together, painstakingly, over the subsequent century and a half from a combination of documentary evidence left in stone cairns, physical evidence in the form of human remains and discarded equipment found by later expeditions, and the oral histories of the Inuit people who lived in the region and who encountered the dying men as they struggled south. The Inuit accounts, preserved in oral tradition and eventually recorded by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, are among the most important and most heartbreaking sources of information about the Franklin expedition's final weeks. Multiple Inuit groups described seeing large groups of men dragging sledges across the ice, gaunt men, weakened men who were clearly suffering from something beyond mere cold and hunger. Modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains found at various sites along the presumed route of the march has revealed evidence of scurvy, lead poisoning, likely from the improperly soldered tin cans that had preserved their food supply, and in some cases evidence of cannibalism in the final desperate stages of starvation. Not a single man survived. Of the 105 who walked off the ships in April of 1848, every one of them died on the ice or on the barren coast of King William Island, their bones scattered across the tundra, some collected and buried by Inuit families, others left where they fell. The expedition that had set out with such confidence, with such equipment, with such national hope invested in it, had been absorbed entirely by the Arctic, leaving behind nothing but bones and questions. For 166 years, Erebus and Terror lay on the bottom of the sea, undisturbed. Then, in September of 2014, a Canadian underwater survey team found HMS Erebus, lying in relatively shallow water on the floor of what is now called Erebus Bay, off the south coast of King William Island. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was found in an even better state of preservation, sitting upright on the seafloor in Terror Bay, a place the local Inuit had known about for generations and had tried repeatedly to tell the archaeologists and historians about. The ships were found where the Inuits said they were. The ships were found because someone finally listened to the people who had been there all along. The world into which Erebus and Terror sailed was in one important sense genuinely unknown. The maps of the Canadian Arctic in 1845 were filled with uncertainties, coastlines sketched from rough observations, channels marked with notes warning of unverified depth, large areas simply labelled unexplored or supposed land. The Admiralty's charts were the product of decades of incremental exploration by a series of expeditions, each one adding a little more information to the picture. But the picture was still fundamentally incomplete. Franklin and his officers knew this. They knew that they were sailing into territory where the charts could not be fully trusted, where the ice conditions had never been systematically recorded, where the currents and tides and magnetic variations were understood only partially. What they did not know, what no one fully knew in 1845, was the degree to which the Arctic climate of the mid-19th century was in a phase of unusual severity. Modern climate research, including analysis of ice core samples and tree ring records from subarctic forests, has established that the 1840s were part of a period of extended cold in the Arctic, sometimes called the Little Ice Age, during which the sea ice in the Canadian archipelago was more extensive and more persistent than it would be in the warmer decades that followed. The Franklin expedition sailed into the worst possible climatic conditions for the route it was attempting, at a time when no one had the data to know that those conditions were exceptional rather than typical. The first winter at Beechey Island, while forcing a longer than expected layover, was not in itself catastrophic. The 3 deaths that occurred there, John Torrington, John Hartnell and William Brain, whose remarkably well-preserved bodies were exhumed and examined by modern researchers in the 1980s, appear to have resulted from a combination of underlying health conditions exacerbated by the physical demands of Arctic service. Torrington, the first to die, was 20 years old and had been ill with what was likely tuberculosis before the ship even sailed. Hartnell and Brain followed within days of each other in January of 1846. Their exhumation provided remarkable forensic evidence about the expedition's health. Evidence of lead poisoning, likely from the poorly soldered tin cans that formed a significant part of the food supply, evidence of pneumonia, evidence of the general nutritional deficiency that Arctic overwintering produced even in well-provisioned expeditions. The lead question is one of the most discussed aspects of the Franklin expedition in modern historical scholarship. The Navy's new canned food supply, which Erebus and Terror carried in enormous quantities, was sealed using a lead-based solder that was applied imperfectly in many cases, allowing the lead to leach into the food contents. Lead poisoning, accumulating slowly over months of eating from these cans, would produce symptoms that could easily be mistaken for the general deterioration of health associated with prolonged Arctic service. Fatigue, irritability, cognitive difficulties, weakness, loss of coordination. If the officers and men of the Franklin expedition were consuming significant quantities of lead through their food supply throughout the expedition, then every decision they made about whether to stay with the ships or abandon them, about which direction to march, about how to allocate diminishing resources, would have been made by people whose judgment was progressively compromised by heavy metal poisoning. The implications of this are both tragic and deeply interesting. The search for Franklin that began in 1848, when the expedition was first overdue and continued in various forms for the next decade and a half, was itself one of the most extraordinary episodes in Arctic exploration history. The British Admiralty dispatched no fewer than 40 separate expeditions to find the lost ships and their crews, at enormous expense and at the cost of several additional lives. The scale of this effort was partly driven by genuine concern for the expedition members and partly by the national pride that had been invested in the expedition, partly by the pressure from Lady Franklin, Jane Franklin, the captain's wife, who became one of the most persistent and effective advocates for the search in the history of maritime rescue, financing several private expeditions from her own resources and lobbying the Admiralty and politicians with a tenacity that made her one of the best-known women in Britain. Jane Franklin's role in the search for her husband is one of the more remarkable stories within the larger Franklin story. She was 62 years old when the expedition was first declared lost, at an age when Victorian social convention would have directed her toward quiet grief and domestic retirement. Instead, she became the driving force behind the search effort, corresponding with American and British geographical societies, writing letters to heads of state, contributing financially to multiple expeditions, and maintaining for over a decade the public and political pressure that kept the search alive when the Admiralty's own interest was beginning to flag. She was finally rewarded in a bitter and incomplete way when the McClintock expedition of 1857 to 1859 returned from King William Island with physical evidence of the expedition's fate, including the only written record that was ever found, a single sheet of paper placed in a cairn on the island's northwest coast. The Victory Point Note, as it is known, is perhaps the most poignant single document in the history of Arctic exploration. It was a standard Admiralty form printed on waterproof paper, designed to be placed in a bottle and thrown overboard so that if found it could be returned to the Admiralty with information about the ship's position and condition. Franklin's expedition had used these forms during the first year of the voyage, filling in the ship's position at intervals and dropping them overboard, and several had been found by other ships in the following years, routine messages giving latitude and longitude, nothing more. The Victory Point Note was different. It had been written in 2 stages. The first entry, written in the margins of the form in a neat hand, recorded that the expedition had wintered at Beechey Island in 1845–46 and was in excellent condition, and that Sir John Franklin was commanding. The second entry was written in different handwriting, cramped and irregular, in pencil around the edges of the same form. It recorded that Franklin had died on the 11th of June, 1847, that the ships had been abandoned on the 22nd of April, 1848, and that the survivors were departing on foot for the Back River. It ended with the words, "and start on tomorrow, 26th April, 1848, for Back's Fish River." There was nothing else. 160 years after that note was written, researchers examining the Erebus wreck found evidence that some members of the expedition may have returned to the ship after the main party marched south. Cabinets and lockers below decks showed signs of having been systematically searched. Not the casual searching of a ship being stripped for stores, but the methodical searching of people looking for something specific. The question of whether some small group of survivors reached the ship, lived aboard it for a period, and eventually died there or sailed it to its final resting place is one of the more tantalizing open questions in the ongoing investigation of the Franklin expedition. The physical evidence is consistent with the hypothesis. The oral traditions of the Inuit in the region are consistent with the hypothesis. What no one has yet found is the documentary evidence that would confirm or refute it. Ice traps a ship slowly. It announces its intentions over days and weeks, giving the crew time to understand what is happening and, at least in theory, to respond. Fire at sea offers no such courtesy. Fire is fast, and on a ship, where everything is made of flammable material, where cargo holds contain oils and spirits and wool and cotton and grain, where the rigging is saturated with tar and the deck timbers are dried by years of sun and salt wind. Fire does not negotiate. The particular horror of fire at sea is a horror of geometry. On land, when a building burns, you run away from it. The direction you run is determined by what is available. Streets, fields, neighbouring buildings. But the critical point is that there is somewhere to go. The building is finite and the earth around it is not burning. At sea, the geometry is reversed. The ship is finite and the ocean around it is not an escape route. It is, depending on the temperature and the distance from land, another way to die. A sailor fleeing a burning ship does not have the luxury of simply moving away from the fire. He has the choice between burning and drowning, and in the maritime disasters of the last 4 centuries, both choices have claimed their share of lives. The story of the SS Cospatrick illustrates the catastrophe of fire at sea with a clarity that is almost unbearable to read. The Cospatrick was a sailing ship, still operating under canvas, though the steamship era was well advanced by 1874, the year of her final voyage. She was an emigrant vessel carrying passengers from London to New Zealand, a long and demanding passage around the southern tip of Africa and across the Southern Ocean. On the 18th of November 1874, she was approximately 600 miles southwest of the Cape of Good Hope in the South Atlantic, far from any shipping lane, far from any coast, far from any possible help. The fire started in the forward hold in the early hours of the morning. The specific cause was never definitively established, but the most likely explanation is a spark from a lantern carried by someone who had gone below to access the stores, possibly to steal spirits from the cargo hold, which was a persistent problem on emigrant vessels, where the combination of boredom and anxiety pushed some passengers to desperate measures. Whatever the cause, the fire caught quickly in the hold, which contained rope, paint, spirits, and oakum, the tarred fibre used for caulking, and within minutes of its discovery it was beyond any possibility of control. The Cospatrick carried 479 people, passengers and crew combined. The fire drove them all toward the stern of the ship, away from the blazing bow, and in the darkness and the smoke and the panic, the process of launching the lifeboats became a catastrophe of its own. The boats on the burning side of the ship were inaccessible. The boats on the windward side, the side away from the fires, were launched, but in the chaos of launching them in open ocean, with panicking people scrambling and fighting to get aboard, several were swamped or overturned. Men fell into the water, women fell into the water, children fell into the water. The Southern Ocean is, even in November, bitterly cold. The Cospatrick burned for 2 days. For 2 days, the people in the lifeboats could see their ship burning on the horizon, a beacon that no passing vessel noticed or responded to. In the lifeboats, the situation deteriorated rapidly. There was no water, there was no food. The weather in the Southern Ocean in November is not calm. The Southern Ocean is never calm, not really, and the boats were thrown about by the swells, shipping water constantly, forcing constant bailing. Men and women began dying of exposure, then thirst, then, in the most terrible accounts of the survivors, things worse than thirst. When the brigantine Scindia found the survivors 5 days after the fire, there were 3 people alive. Of 479, 3 had survived. The accounts those 3 gave to the officers of the Scindia were, by any measure, among the most disturbing testimonies in the history of maritime disaster. Accounts of what had happened in the lifeboats in the dark of the Southern Ocean, of the choices that had been made, of the things that had been done and endured. The 3 survivors included Henry MacDonald, the second mate of the Cospatrick, who lived long enough to give his testimony and then died shortly after being brought aboard the rescuing ship. His account, recorded by the officers of the Scindia and eventually published in the shipping press, reads like something from the outer edge of human experience, which of course it was. Fire at sea in the modern era has never been fully tamed, because the fundamental problem, the geometry of being surrounded by water with nowhere to run, has never changed. The Morocastle disaster of 1934, in which a luxury American cruise ship caught fire off the New Jersey coast and 137 people, died within sight of the Asbury Park beachfront, demonstrated that even in the age of radio, even within visual distance of a populated shore, fire on a ship could kill on a scale that seemed impossible in the supposedly modern world. The ship had radio, it sent a distress signal, help came, and 137 people still died because fire moves faster than rescue. The Morro Castle investigation revealed failures of training, of equipment, of leadership, and of fundamental seamanship that were shocking to the American public and eventually led to significant reforms in maritime safety law. The captain of the Morro Castle had died of a sudden heart attack the night before the fire, leaving the ship in the hands of his first officer, who was accused, though never convicted, of abandoning the ship before making adequate efforts to save the passengers. The fire itself may have been deliberately set. The investigation produced evidence pointing toward arson, and suspicion fell heavily on the radio operator Georgia Lagner, who had a documented grudge against the ship's management. Nothing was ever proven. The fire remains, in its origins, officially unexplained. The Morro Castle burned and killed, and then grounded itself on the beach at Asbury Park, New Jersey, where it sat for months as a morbid tourist attraction, while the investigation produced more questions than answers. It is, in this sense, typical of maritime disasters at their worst, catastrophic in its consequences, murky in its causes, and never fully resolved. There is a category of maritime mystery that stands apart from all others, not the ship that burned, not the ship that sank, not the ship that was crushed by ice, but the ship that arrived at its destination or was found drifting at sea in perfectly good condition, with all its cargo intact, with no sign of catastrophic damage, with the captain's log open on the table and the cook's food still warm on the stove, with in fact every single sign that life had been going on normally aboard the vessel, right up until some moment that the evidence refuses to specify, except that when the first person stepped over the rail there was nobody there. The crew was gone. The captain was gone. Everyone was gone, and the ship sailed on without them, as if the ocean had simply reached up and taken everyone aboard and left the vessel itself untouched. No ship in the history of maritime mystery has generated more speculation, more legend, more outright fiction, and more persistent fascination than the Mary Celeste, a story so well known in its broad outlines that it has become a cultural reference, shorthand for any situation where people have mysteriously vanished, leaving behind all the evidence of their ordinary lives. But the actual historical story of the Mary Celeste is both stranger and more specific than the legend, and it repays careful attention. The Mary Celeste was an American brigantine, a two-masted sailing vessel, registered in New York and in her day considered a perfectly ordinary commercial cargo ship. She had been launched in 1861 in Nova Scotia under the name Amazon, had changed hands several times, and had a history that was checkered enough in its run of misfortunes that sailors who knew her history considered her unlucky. Her first captain had died of pneumonia shortly after she launched. She had been damaged in a collision with another vessel early in her career. She had run aground on Cape Breton Island. By the time she was renamed Mary Celeste and registered in New York in 1872, she had, by the superstitious accounting of maritime tradition, a history that should have given her new captain pause. Her new captain was Benjamin Spooner Briggs, 40 years old, a native of Massachusetts, experienced and well regarded in the New York shipping community. Briggs had captained several vessels before the Mary Celeste and had a reputation for being a careful, sober, deeply religious man, the kind of captain who enforced a strict watch schedule and maintained discipline through example rather than punishment. In late October of 1872, Briggs loaded the Mary Celeste with 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol, denatured ethyl alcohol, destined for wine fortification in Genoa, Italy, and took her into New York Harbor to make final preparations for departure. He also, unusually, brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia aboard for the voyage. Sarah Briggs was herself a sailor's daughter, comfortable at sea, and she and her husband corresponded warmly and extensively when they were separated. Her letters from the months before the voyage have survived and give a vivid picture of a woman looking forward to the passage to Italy with something close to excitement. The Mary Celeste left New York on the 7th of November, 1872, bound for Genoa with a crew of 7 plus the captain and his family, 10 people in total. A month later, on the 4th of December, the brigantine Dei Gracia, sailing the same Atlantic route roughly a week behind the Mary Celeste, spotted a vessel behaving oddly. It was sailing erratically, not holding a steady course, yawing from side to side as if no one was at the helm. The Dei Gratia's captain, David Morehouse, who knew Briggs personally, altered course to investigate. What Morehouse and his men found when they boarded the Mary Celeste has been debated ever since. The ship was in fair condition, though the forehatch was open and there was some water below decks. Not enough to explain abandonment, experienced sailors agreed, but present. The single lifeboat was missing. The binnacle, the housing for the compass, was damaged. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, which suggested that navigation instruments had been deliberately taken when the ship was abandoned, which in turn suggested that the abandonment had not been an instant panic, but something more deliberate. The cargo of alcohol was almost entirely intact. Only 3.5 barrels had leaked or been opened. The cook's galley contained the remains of a meal. In the captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs's sewing kit lay on the table, her work apparently set down mid-project. Sophia's small toys were in the cabin. The ship's log was present, with the last entry dated November 25th, 9 days before the Dei Gratia found her, placing the Mary Celeste at a position roughly 600 miles west of where she was found, which meant she had sailed unmanned for 9 days and 600 miles without hitting anything. The subsequent inquiry at Gibraltar, where Morehouse brought the Mary Celeste as a salvage prize, raised more questions than it answered. The Admiralty lawyer overseeing the inquiry, Frederick Solly Flood, became convinced that there had been foul play, that the crew of the Dei Gratia had somehow killed the crew of the Mary Celeste and then staged the discovery to claim salvage money. He was wrong, and his theory was never supported by the evidence, but his aggressive pursuit of it shaped the early narrative around the mystery and established the tone of dark suspicion that has surrounded the story ever since. The most credible modern theories about what happened to the Mary Celeste center on the alcohol cargo. 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, even denatured alcohol, will release vapors, and those vapors are highly flammable. The most detailed and technically rigorous hypothesis, developed by marine biologist and historian Menson Bound, among others, suggests that a buildup of alcohol vapor in the cargo hold caused an explosion, not a major structural explosion but a loud, sudden, percussive event, an alcohol bomb caused by vapor pressure in the barrels. Such an explosion would have been terrifying. It would have convinced everyone aboard that the ship was about to blow up, while leaving surprisingly little physical damage. Briggs, trained in seamanship but perhaps inexperienced with this particular cargo, may have ordered the crew and his family into the lifeboat to wait at a safe distance while he assessed the situation. And then something happened. The lifeboat line snapped, or a wave separated them from the ship, or the wind shifted, and they found themselves in the Atlantic in an open boat, watching their ship sail away from them. They were never found. Not the captain, not his wife, not little Sophia, not a single one of the 7 crew members. The North Atlantic in December does not give back what it takes. The Mary Celeste herself continued to operate as a cargo vessel under a series of subsequent owners for the next 12 years, none of whom wanted to be associated with her history, but all of whom found the ship perfectly functional. She was finally run aground deliberately on a reef off Haiti in 1885, in what was almost certainly an insurance fraud scheme, and broke up on the reef. Her story has never been officially resolved. The Mary Celeste was not unique. The pages of maritime history contain dozens of ghost ship accounts, most of them far less famous but no less mysterious in their particulars. The Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted schooner found drifting in the graveyard of the Atlantic, the Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in January of 1921, is perhaps the most carefully documented ghost ship of the modern era. She was found with her anchors deployed, her lifeboats gone, food cooking in the galley, and not a single person of her 11-man crew anywhere on the ship or ever found thereafter. The subsequent investigation by the United States government, which involved multiple federal agencies and lasted more than a year, concluded only that the fate of the crew was unknown. It remains unknown today, more than a century later. The ghost ship phenomenon has attracted every category of explanation, from the mundane to the bizarre, and the history of proposed solutions to these mysteries is itself a fascinating document in the history of human reasoning under uncertainty. The Mary Celeste, in particular, has attracted hypotheses that range from the careful and plausible to the frankly absurd. In the century and a half since her discovery, She's been attributed to piracy, to mutiny, to the intervention of giant squid, to time displacement, to spontaneous human combustion, to the attention of extraterrestrial visitors, and to a remarkable variety of natural and unnatural causes, none of which the actual evidence particularly supports. The reason the Mary Celeste continues to generate these theories, more than 150 years after the event, is precisely because the available evidence is not quite enough to settle the question. There is enough information to eliminate some hypotheses. The ship was not destroyed, so the crew did not die in an explosion. The cargo was intact, so this was not a conventional piracy. The condition of the personal effects in the cabins was not consistent with a sudden panic, so whatever happened probably unfolded over at least a few minutes rather than in an instant. But there is not enough information to positively establish what did happen, and this gap is exactly the right size for speculation to flourish. What is sometimes overlooked in the fixation on the mystery of the Mary Celeste's crew is the broader context that the case inhabits. Abandonment of ships at sea, not mysterious abandonment, but the ordinary, documented, understood, kind, was more common in the 19th century than popular history suggests. The maritime record from the 1870s shows dozens of cases each year of ships being found at sea without crews, with their lifeboats gone, the result of captains who had decided to abandon a vessel they believed to be sinking or fatally damaged, only for the ship to prove more seaworthy than they had judged. The ordinary physics of wooden ships at sea meant that hulls could take on a surprising amount of water and still float. A captain who ordered abandonment based on the rate of flooding he was observing might find, if he looked back at his ship an hour later, that it was still on the surface and sailing. In many of these ordinary abandonment cases, the crew made it to shore or was rescued, and the story was told and recorded and explained. In the Mary Celeste's case, no one survived to explain, or if they did, they were never identified or never came forward. The mystery is not, at its root, why the ship was abandoned. It is why no one who was on it was ever accounted for afterward. The sea has always been a highway for disease as much as for trade, and sometimes the two are identical. The ships that carried merchants and soldiers and colonists and enslaved people across the oceans of the world also carried, in the bodies of those people, and in the rats that lived below decks, and in the contaminated water barrels and the insect-infested grain, a biological cargo as consequential as any spice or precious metal. Smallpox crossed the Atlantic on Columbus's ships. Bubonic plague travelled the Silk Road trade routes on vessels that moved through the Mediterranean. Yellow fever, typhus and cholera colonized the shipping lanes of the world as thoroughly as any European empire colonized its new territories. But disease at sea was not merely a vector of larger epidemic history. It was also, in its own right, one of the most terrible ways that a ship could be trapped, marooned not by wind or ice but by biology, unable to approach any port, unable to receive any help, unable to do anything but ride at anchor under the yellow quarantine flag and watch the sick die and hope that enough of the crew survived to eventually sail the ship into harbour. The Yellow Jack, the name sailors gave to both yellow fever and the yellow quarantine flag that was flown to warn other ships away, was one of the most feared phenomena in maritime history. Yellow fever is caused by a virus transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, and in the age before this was understood, before anyone knew that mosquitoes had anything to do with disease, before the germ theory of illness had been established, it struck ships as if from nowhere, with no logic and no pattern that anyone could discern, and it killed with a speed and efficiency that was almost artistic in its horror. The progression of yellow fever in a patient who has no immunity to it, which meant virtually every European and North American sailor who encountered it, follows a characteristic arc that begins with fever and headache and progresses in serious cases through jaundice, which turns the skin and whites of the eyes yellow, explaining the disease's name, to the black vomit that is the most dramatically recognizable symptom, and finally to organ failure and death. The entire progression from first symptoms to death could take less than a week. On a ship at sea, where the mosquitoes that carried the disease had nowhere to go, and the crew had nowhere to escape, yellow fever could move through a vessel with a speed that observers compared to fire. The British West India Squadron, which was responsible for suppressing the Atlantic slave trade in the first half of the 19th century, lost more men to yellow fever than to any action of the slavers they were hunting. In a particularly bad season, and they came regularly, because the squadron operated precisely in the tropical Atlantic waters, where the disease was endemic by a ship might arrive in the region with a full complement of officers and men and return to England months later with half her original crew dead or disabled. The ships themselves became objects of dread, approached cautiously by other vessels even after they returned to home waters because the disease's mechanism of transmission was unknown, and even its persistence or non-persistence on surfaces and objects was a matter of medical guesswork. One of the most thoroughly documented yellow fever crises in maritime history involves the American merchant ship William Brown, which operated in the Atlantic trade in the 1830s and was caught in a yellow fever outbreak during a voyage from New Orleans to Liverpool in the summer of 1837. The ship's surgeon, a Dr. Elias Holt, kept a detailed clinical log of the outbreak that has been preserved and studied by medical historians. By Holt's account, the disease appeared on the second day out of New Orleans, almost certainly already established in the mosquito population in the bilge water, and spread to the crew with a speed that he found clinically astounding. Within 10 days of the first case, 23 of the ship's 38 crew members were ill and 7 were dead. Holt himself fell ill on the 14th day and spent the following week in a state he describes as violent dissolution of the bodily faculties, surviving only because his illness resolved before the final stages set in. The captain of the William Brown, facing a crew so reduced by illness that he lacked the manpower to sail the ship properly, made the decision that many captains in similar circumstances were forced to make. He turned back. New Orleans, the port they had left, was closer than Liverpool, and turning back meant shorter exposure to the elements for the sick. It also meant sailing back into the epidemic region from which they had just emerged, which carried its own risks, but the alternative, continuing across the Atlantic with a crew that could barely stand their watches, seemed more immediately lethal. The William Brown made port in New Orleans after 3 weeks at sea, having lost 11 men, with 8 more so severely ill that they were hospitalized immediately on arrival. The ship itself was quarantined, not for the first time in its career, in the anchorage outside the harbour, where the authorities maintained a floating quarantine station, a collection of hulks and converted vessels where sick ships and sick passengers waited out their illnesses or died at a distance from the healthy population of the city. Quarantine anchorages were one of the most distinctive features of the pre-modern port city, and they are worth pausing to consider because they represent something close to a maritime purgatory, a zone between the sea, with all its dangers, and the land, with all its safety, where ships and people waited in a condition of enforced suspension, neither fully at risk nor fully rescued, under the authority of port officials who controlled the gates between the maritime world and the terrestrial one. The quarantine laws of the great Mediterranean ports, Venice, Genoa, Marseille, were among the most sophisticated pieces of public health legislation in pre-modern European history, and they grew directly from the terror of epidemic disease arriving on ships. Venice's quarantine station on the island of Lazaretto Vecchio, established in the 15th century, was the first purpose-built quarantine facility in the world, and it gave the word quarantine to the world, from the Venetian term quarantino, meaning 40 days, which was the period of isolation that arriving ships were required to observe before their passengers and cargo could be brought ashore. 40 days in a quarantine anchorage was not a simple administrative inconvenience. It was 40 days of exposure to the disease that had put the ship in quarantine in the first place, and for many passengers and crew it was a death sentence. The quarantine itself could not cure the disease that prompted it. It could only prevent the disease from spreading to the shore, which was a social good of enormous importance, but provided cold comfort to the people dying aboard the anchored ship. The quarantine anchorage was, in a very real sense, a place where the city sacrificed the individual for the sake of the community, where the mathematical logic of epidemic control required that some people be allowed to die so that others might live. The history of epidemic disease in maritime contexts is inseparable from the history of the slave trade, and this connection deserves more than a passing mention. The Middle Passage, the forced transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, was, among its many horrors, one of the largest and most sustained disease disasters in human history. The ships that carried enslaved people were, by the nature of their operation, disease factories, hundreds of people deliberately crowded into spaces that provided each person with less room than a coffin, for voyages that lasted between 3 and 8 weeks, in tropical heat, with minimal water and worse food. The mortality rates on slave ships during the height of the trade, roughly the 17th through early 19th centuries, were catastrophic by any measure. Estimates suggest that of the approximately 12.5 million Africans who were forced aboard slave ships, something between 1 and 2 million died before they reached their destinations. The diseases that killed them, dysentery above all, which spread with terrifying speed in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of the slaveholds, but also smallpox, yellow fever, and a range of respiratory infections, also killed the crews that operated the ships. Sailors on slave ships died at rates significantly higher than sailors on other forms of maritime trade. The specific combination of tropical routes, the disease reservoirs that the enslaved passengers represented, infected with diseases for which many Africans had some partial immunity, but to which European sailors had none, and the unsanitary conditions that the operation of the trade made unavoidable, produced mortality rates among slave ship crews that contemporary observers noted with a kind of horrified arithmetic in their reports to trading companies and parliamentary committees. The quarantine stations that developed around the major Atlantic and Mediterranean ports were not, in their origins, designed to address slave trade mortality. They were designed to protect the commercial and residential populations of port cities from the epidemics that arrived on all kinds of ships. But they were applied to slave ships along with everything else, and the quarantine anchorage experience for a slave ship was a peculiar kind of hell. The disease was already aboard and had been for weeks, and the 40 days of quarantine that the port authorities required were simply 40 more days of confinement for people who had already been confined for weeks. The quarantine that was supposed to protect the city required those already most vulnerable to continue suffering. A ship at sea is, among other things, a political unit, a small society governed by a specific set of laws, customs, and power relationships, subject to all the stresses and contradictions that any society experiences, but compressed into a space measured in dozens of feet rather than thousands of miles, with no possibility of exit, no possibility of appeal to any external authority, and no way to resolve conflicts except through the mechanisms available within the ship itself. The captain's authority was, in the legal framework of the Age of Sail, as close to absolute as any secular power that existed. He could order physical punishment. He could order confinement. He could, in theory, order execution. The law supported him. The tradition supported him. The practical necessity of maintaining order on a ship at sea supported him. And sometimes none of that was enough, because the same isolation that made the captain's authority so extreme also made the crew's grievances so unresolvable. When a sailor had a complaint against his captain in a port, he could desert, he could appeal to the port authority, he could find another ship. At sea, none of these options existed. The ship was the only world there was, and if that world was intolerable, if the captain was brutal, if the provisions were rotten, if the promised wages were being withheld, if the ship was being sailed into obvious danger, then the crew had precisely two choices: endure it or take the ship. The mutiny on the Bounty in 1789 is by far the most famous maritime mutiny in history, partly because of the extraordinary subsequent adventures of both the mutineers and the men they cast adrift, and partly because it has been retold so many times in fiction and film that the real story has become almost completely buried under layers of dramatization. The real story is more complex, more human, and more morally ambiguous than any of the dramatizations have managed to capture. H.M.S. Bounty sailed from England in December of 1787, commanded by Lieutenant William Bligh, not captain, notably, because the Admiralty had given the command to a lieutenant rather than a full captain as an economy measure, a decision that would have significant consequences for the social dynamics aboard the ship. The mission was to collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transport them to the British Caribbean colonies, where it was hoped they would provide a cheap food source for the enslaved population working the sugar plantations. It was, by the standards of the time, not a particularly dangerous or demanding mission. The Bounty was a small ship, 90 feet long, with a crew of 46, and Tahiti was well-charted and friendly territory by the late 18th century. The voyage out took 10 months, including a 5-month attempt around Cape Horn in the southern winter that ultimately failed and forced Bligh to turn east and cross the Pacific from the opposite direction, arriving at Tahiti in October of 1788. The 5 months spent trying and failing to round the Horn, the cape that guards the southern tip of South America and is regularly described as the most dangerous body of water on Earth, were brutal. The ship was small, the seas were enormous, and the constant stress of the attempt, combined with the failure to make progress for month after month, took a toll on both crew and captain that set the stage for everything that followed. The 5 months in Tahiti were the opposite experience entirely, and therein lay the problem. Tahitian society in 1788 was, from the perspective of British sailors, a paradise of warmth, food, and social freedom that stood in absolute contrast to everything they had known. Many of the crew formed close attachments, some of them deep and lasting, with Tahitian people during the 5-month stay, and when the Bounty finally departed in April of 1789 for the long voyage back to England via the West Indies, the psychological gap between what they were leaving and what they were returning to was as wide as the Pacific itself. Fletcher Christian, the master's mate who led the mutiny, was by all accounts a man of education, sensitivity, and considerable inner conflict. He and Bligh had known each other since before the voyage. Bligh had given Christian his first command posting years earlier, had apparently regarded him as something of a protégé. The relationship between them during the voyage had curdled, partly because Bligh's leadership style was marked by a particularly cutting form of public verbal humiliation. He would dress down his officers in front of the crew in language that veterans of the Navy described as unusually harsh, even by the rough standards of the time. Christian, by the accounts of both sides, was a man who felt these humiliations deeply and personally, who had the pride and sensitivity that made them particularly difficult to endure, and who reached a breaking point that, in the isolated world of the Bounty, had only one direction to travel. On the morning of the 28th of April, 1789, 23 days out of Tahiti, Christian led a party of men to Bligh's cabin before dawn, woke the captain at gunpoint, and took the ship. Bligh and 18 loyal crew members were put into the ship's 23-foot open launch with a compass, a quadrant, some food, and minimal water, and set adrift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 30 miles off the island of Tofua. What Bligh did next was one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship in history. He sailed that open boat nearly 4,000 miles to the Dutch settlement of Timor, navigating with a quadrant and a watch and the sheer force of his considerable navigational knowledge, losing only one man, killed by stones thrown by hostile islanders when the party attempted to land on Tofua. Bligh's open boat voyage took 47 days and covered 3,600 nautical miles. It is, by any measure, a testament to human endurance and navigational genius. The mutineer's story is equally remarkable in its way, and considerably darker. 25 of them attempted to settle on the island of Tubuai, failed, returned to Tahiti, and split into 2 groups. 16 remained on Tahiti. 9, including Christian, took 8 Tahitian men, 6 Tahitian women, and 1 Tahitian girl aboard the Bounty, and sailed away in search of an island remote enough that the Royal Navy would never find them. That island was Pitcairn, tiny and isolated in the South Pacific, so rarely visited that the Bounty mutineers who arrived there in January of 1790 found it uninhabited and uncharted on most maps. They burned the Bounty in Pitcairn's small harbour. The charred anchor was found by a later expedition, to prevent anyone from leaving and to hide their presence from passing ships. What followed on Pitcairn was not a pastoral idyll, but a community fractured by violence, jealousy, and the profound social tensions of its founding. Of the 9 mutineers who landed on Pitcairn, all but 1 were dead within 5 years, killed in fights with each other, or with the Tahitian men, or by their own hands. Fletcher Christian himself was dead within 2 years, killed in circumstances that the surviving accounts, filtered through memory and self-interest, have never clearly established. By 1800, the entire founding generation of the Pitcairn settlement was reduced to a single surviving mutineer, John Adams, living with the surviving Tahitian women and their children. When the American sealing ship Topaz found Pitcairn in 1808, 18 years after the Bounty's arrival, it found Adams, who gave his name to the ship as Alexander Smith, surrounded by a community of women and children who spoke a Creole language that blended English and Tahitian, and who lived according to rules that Adams, in his old age, had drawn from the Bible and from the deep memory of everything that had gone wrong. The Bounty mutineers who remained on Tahiti when Fletcher Christian sailed away with the Bounty toward Pitcairn had their own catastrophic story. The 16 men who stayed were eventually arrested by HMS Pandora, dispatched by the Admiralty to find the mutineers in 1791. The Pandora's captain, Edward Edwards, treated his prisoners with a harshness that became notorious even by the standards of the era. Confining them in a wooden cage built on the ship's deck, exposed to the tropical sun, fed minimally, denied basic sanitation. He called this cage Pandora's box, with a grim humour that suggests something about his character. When the Pandora was wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef on her homeward voyage, run aground in darkness on the reef's outer edge, Edwards kept his prisoners confined in the sinking ship until the very last possible moment, and 4 of the prisoners drowned when the cage was finally opened. The 10 surviving prisoners were eventually tried by court-martial in England. 3 were hanged, 3 were acquitted, and 4 were convicted but pardoned. The trial, closely followed by the British public, was the first occasion on which the full story of the bounty and its aftermath was presented in detail to a general audience, and the public response was notably divided. Many people, reading about the delights of Tahiti and the reportedly harsh treatment of the crew by Bligh, found it difficult to maintain the simple moral calculus that the Admiralty and the court-martial proceedings were designed to uphold. Fletcher Christian, who was dead on Pitcairn before any of this happened, became something close to a romantic hero in the popular imagination, the sensitive young officer driven to desperate action by tyranny, escaping to a South Seas paradise. The fact that his paradise had become a bloodbath within a few years of his arrival was not part of the story that the public preferred. Bligh himself, returning to England after his extraordinary open-boat voyage, was celebrated as a hero of seamanship and eventually promoted to vice-admiral. He was also, somewhat extraordinarily, given command of another ship and another voyage to the same region, and another mutiny occurred on this second voyage, a briefer and less dramatic one, in which Bligh was once again removed from his ship by disaffected crew members. 2 mutinies in one career is a statistically unusual result, and historians have debated ever since whether this tells us more about Bligh's leadership style or about the particular tensions of Pacific voyaging in the late 18th century. The weight of historical opinion has shifted back and forth. Early 20th century historians tended to rehabilitate Bligh and present Christian as the villain. Later scholarship has been more nuanced, acknowledging that Bligh's management style was genuinely difficult and that the particular circumstances of the bounty voyage, the 5-month attempt on the Horn, the enforced idleness in Tahiti, the combination of a small ship and a long voyage with a captain whose verbal cruelty left lasting wounds, created the specific conditions for what happened. What the Bounty Mutiny and the dozens of lesser-known mutinies in maritime history collectively demonstrate is something important about the specific quality of isolation at sea. Isolation does not simply create danger from the outside, from storms and ice and calms and disease. It also creates danger from within, because it removes all the external structures that normally regulate human social behaviour. On land, a man who felt his employer had treated him unjustly had options. He could complain to a magistrate, he could leave and find other work, could talk to his family, he could do any of the things that social animals do when their social contracts are being violated. At sea, on a ship 1,000 miles from any land, a man who felt he had been treated unjustly had no such options. He could endure, he could confront his captain directly, which was at minimum a flogging offence, or he could attempt to take control of the situation by force. The extreme rarity of mutiny, given the extreme frequency of genuine grievances on sailing ships, is actually one of the more remarkable aspects of maritime social history. Most sailors endured. They endured because they had to, and because the alternatives were legally and practically dangerous, and because the particular professional culture of the sea, its pride in endurance, its respect for skill, its distrust of weakness, made endurance itself a form of identity. Modern psychology has a term for the particular suite of psychological effects that prolonged isolation produces in human beings, sensory deprivation syndrome, or, in its more specifically maritime form, the constellation of symptoms that researchers who study long-duration sea voyages have documented in single-handed sailors, polar expeditioners, and submarine crews. The symptoms include altered time perception, hypnagogic hallucinations, visions that occur in the borderline state between waking and sleeping, heightened emotional reactivity, irrational decision-making, and, in extended cases, a detachment from reality that can progress to genuine psychosis. The research on this phenomenon has been conducted primarily in the modern era, using the experience of solo ocean racers and polar explorers as study populations, but the symptoms it describes are entirely consistent with the accounts that sailors and captains left in their logs and diaries from the age of sail. Consider what it would mean to spend 8 months at sea on a small ship in the company of the same 50 or 60 people, with no new social contact, no new visual landscape, no change in the basic sensory environment except what the weather provided. The human brain is optimized for variety, for novel stimuli, for changing social relationships, for the constant small surprises and adjustments that make up ordinary social life. Remove all of that, and the brain does not simply go quiet. It generates its own input, fills in the gaps with material from memory and imagination, and begins to process that internally generated material in ways that can become increasingly detached from external reality. The logs of long voyage ships from the 17th and 18th centuries contain accounts of strange mental phenomena that their authors often attributed to supernatural causes because the natural causes were not yet understood. Sailors reported seeing lights at sea with no identifiable source, possibly bioluminescence, possibly St. Elmo's fire, possibly genuine hallucinations. They reported hearing voices, seeing figures on deck or in the rigging that proved not to be there, and experiencing premonitions and dreams of unusual vividness that sometimes preceded disasters in ways the sailors found deeply significant. These experiences were real to the people who had them. They were the product of brains pushed to their cognitive limits by isolation, stress, malnutrition, and the particular sensory environment of a ship at sea. The captain's situation was, in some ways, psychologically more demanding than that of any ordinary crew member, because the captain had the added burden of responsibility. The knowledge that every decision he made affected the lives of everyone aboard, that there was no one to consult, no higher authority to defer to, no institutional support available. The loneliness of command at sea was proverbial, and it was not simply a literary convention. It was a documented psychological phenomenon. Captains in the later stages of long voyages sometimes exhibited behaviour that their officers recorded with concern, irrationality, excessive severity, odd preoccupations, a tendency to interpret ambiguous situations in increasingly paranoid terms. Some of these captains were simply displaying the ordinary deterioration of judgment that comes with exhaustion and isolation. Others were experiencing something more serious. The case of Captain Bligh is instructive again here, not because his behaviour was obviously pathological, it was not, but because the accounts of it illustrate so clearly the way that the stress of command at sea could express itself in a form that was destructive without being obviously irrational. Bligh was not a madman. He was a gifted navigator, an experienced officer, a man of considerable courage and genuine professional ability. His habit of publicly humiliating his officers, the specific cruelty of his verbal attacks on men who could not respond to them without career consequences, was an expression of something in his character that the particular conditions of life at sea, the compression of authority, the absence of any mediating social structure, the absolute power that the law gave him over the people around him, amplified until it became unbearable. On land, with access to social structures that distributed power and provided outlets for grievance, his behaviour would have been unpleasant, but manageable. At sea, it became a pressure cooker. Maritime engineering has a concept called the failure cascade. The sequence of events in which one mechanical or structural failure creates the conditions for subsequent failures, each one reducing the ship's ability to respond to the next, until the accumulation of problems overwhelms the crew's ability to manage them. The failure cascade is not unique to ships. It applies to any complex engineered system, but at sea, the failure cascade has a particular quality, because each failure in the sequence occurs in an environment that is actively hostile to the repair of the previous one, and because the ultimate consequence of a complete cascade is not a broken machine, but a sunken ship and lost lives. The sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald in November of 1975 is one of the most carefully studied failure cascades in the history of Great Lakes shipping. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a massive Great Lakes ore carrier, at 729 feet, the largest ship on the Great Lakes at the time of her launching in 1958, and she had been operating successfully for 17 years before her final voyage. On the 10th of November 1975, she was caught in one of the most severe storms recorded on Lake Superior. a storm with sustained winds of over 60 miles an hour and wave heights estimated at 25 to 35 feet. At 7:10 in the evening, the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared from the radar screen of her companion vessel, the Arthur M. Anderson. There was no distress call, there were no survivors. 29 men went down with the ship. The investigation of the Fitzgerald sinking was extensive and contentious, and it raised questions about the condition of the ship's hatches, the massive covers that sealed the cargo hold openings, and whether they were watertight under the conditions encountered in the storm. The most widely accepted theory holds that water entered the cargo holds through inadequately sealed hatches, gradually flooding the spaces forward of the engine room, reducing the ship's buoyancy at the bow, causing her to pitch more steeply into the waves, which caused more water to come aboard, which caused more flooding, in a self-reinforcing cycle that ended when the bow dug into a wave trough and the ship broke in two. If this is what happened, it happened in minutes, perhaps in less than a minute. The Edmund Fitzgerald did not sink slowly. She was there, and then she was not. Gordon Lightfoot wrote a song about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald that was released in 1976 and became one of the most successful Canadian singles of the decade. The song is notable for its careful attention to the factual record. Lightfoot researched the disaster extensively before writing, and for the quality of lamentation it achieves within the constraints of popular music. Does anyone know where the love of God goes, when the waves turn the minutes to hours? It is a line that captures, with genuine precision, what it feels like to read the accounts of the Fitzgerald's last hours, the compression of time that crisis produces, the way that catastrophe transforms ordinary experience, and the specific helplessness of people ashore who knew a ship was in trouble and could do nothing except wait and hope, and eventually stop hoping. The Fitzgerald case also illustrates an aspect of maritime disaster that tends to be underemphasized in the more dramatic accounts: the role of incremental negligence, of small compromises and accepted risks that accumulate over time until they create the conditions for catastrophe. The hatches of the Edmund Fitzgerald had been identified as potentially problematic in at least one previous inspection. The condition of the seals had been noted. The repairs had been scheduled but were not yet complete. This is not a story of obvious negligence. It is a story of the kind of risk management that every operating organisation practices, the constant balancing of known risks against the cost and disruption of addressing them, and the particular tragedy that occurs when the accumulated small risks meet the one storm for which the small risks matter. There is a temptation, when reading through the maritime disasters of the Age of Sail, to feel that the central tragedy is a tragedy of technology, that these things happened because the people of those centuries lacked the radio, the satellite navigation, the weather forecasting, the reliable power sources that would have allowed them to call for help, to know where they were, to understand what was coming. And there is truth in that. Radio alone, arriving as a practical maritime technology in the first decade of the 20th century, transformed the basic mathematics of maritime disaster in ways that saved thousands of lives. The ability to know that a ship was in distress, to know roughly where it was, to dispatch rescue vessels. This was not nothing. This was an enormous and genuine advance. But the temptation to see modern technology as the solution to the problem of maritime isolation is a temptation that the sea has consistently, and sometimes catastrophically, refused to validate. Because the ocean is large, it is very, very large, and the ships that cross it, however modern they may be, are finite objects moving through an environment that does not fundamentally care about them. And when something goes wrong in the right combination of ways, even the most advanced technology can fail to bridge the gap between a ship in distress and any possible source of help. The MV Derbyshire was a British bulk carrier, one of the largest ever built under the British flag. She was launched in 1976, was 965 feet long, and weighed 169,044 gross registered tons. She was modern, she was well maintained, and she was sailing a normal commercial route from the Great Lakes to Japan when, in September of 1980, she encountered Typhoon Orchid in the Pacific and vanished. She sent no distress call. She left. No survivors. She simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a faint oil slick that was reported by another vessel and dismissed at the time as a routine occurrence. The Derbyshire was not a historical relic. She was not an underpowered wooden ship caught in unfamiliar waters. She was a modern steel vessel operated by a professional crew with full radio capability and all the navigation technology available in 1980. And she still vanished without a trace, taking 44 people, officers, crew, and the wives of 2 officers, to the bottom of the Pacific with no warning and no transmission. The wreck was eventually found in 1994 in more than 13,000 feet of water, and the investigation that followed determined that a structural failure at the bow had allowed the sea to flood the forward holds, which in turn overwhelmed the ship's trim and caused it to sink, stern first, with catastrophic speed. The Derbyshire inquiry was, among other things, a story of how isolation still kills even in the modern world, not because there was no radio, but because the disaster was so sudden and so complete that there was no time to use it. The crew of the Derbyshire almost certainly had no more than minutes between the moment things went catastrophically wrong and the moment the ship went under. In those minutes, they were as isolated as any crew in the age of sail. The technology that might have saved them existed, but it could not operate faster than the sea. The El Faro disaster of October 2015 tells a similar story with the added cruelty of documented forewarning. The El Faro was an American cargo ship, regularly serving the route between Jacksonville, Florida and Puerto Rico. She was 39 years old by commercial shipping standards, and had been the subject of concerns about her maintenance and her structural integrity in the years before her final voyage. On the 1st of October 2015, she sailed directly into the path of Hurricane Joaquin, a powerful Atlantic hurricane that had intensified rapidly, and whose track had shifted to intersect with the El Faro's route in ways that the ship's captain, Michael Davidson, had either not fully anticipated or had decided to risk. What makes the El Faro disaster different from almost any other in modern maritime history is the existence of the Voyage Data Recorder, the maritime equivalent of an airplane's black box, which was recovered from the seafloor at 15,000 feet of depth in a major salvage operation. The VDR contained the last 26 hours of bridge communications, and the transcript of that recording was eventually released publicly. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of maritime disaster, a real-time record of a crew making decisions, expressing doubts, reporting deteriorating conditions, and ultimately experiencing the final moments of a ship going down in a Category 4 hurricane. The transcript reveals, among other things, the specific quality of isolation that the El Faro's crew faced. They had communication. They could speak to their company's offices. They could receive weather reports. They could coordinate with the Coast Guard. And yet, as the storm closed around them and the ship began to develop a list from flooding that the pumps could not control, all of that communication amounted to the same thing it had always amounted to on ships in distress since the beginning of maritime history. The knowledge that help existed somewhere, but was not here and could not arrive in time. The El Faro sank on the morning of October 1st, 2015, in position about 35 miles northeast of Crooked Island, Bahamas. All 33 people aboard were lost. The maritime investigation that followed identified multiple contributing factors: captain's judgment, weather forecasting failures, the age and condition of the ship. But the fundamental cause was the same fundamental, because that has killed sailors since the first boat was launched. The sea is dangerous, and distance is unforgiving. The Voyage Data Recorder transcript from the El Faro is a document that anyone seriously interested in the psychology of decision-making under uncertainty should read. It is available publicly as part of the National Transportation Safety Board investigation, and it runs to several hundred pages of transcribed conversation. Reading it is not a comfortable experience because, unlike most historical accounts of maritime disaster, which are narrated in retrospect, often by survivors, and therefore shaped by the knowledge of what happened, the El Faro transcript is narrated in real time by people who do not know what is about to happen, and who are, in each moment, making decisions based on incomplete and rapidly changing information. Captain Davidson, in the hours before the ship went down, was not a man who had lost his grip on reality. He was a man making reasonable-seeming decisions in an unreasonable situation, updating his assessment as new information came in, making calls that could be defended on the basis of what he knew at the time, even if they were catastrophically wrong in light of what he did not know. He had checked the Weather Routing Service's prediction for Joaquin. He had factored in the ship's speed and the storm's projected track. He had concluded that they would pass the storm at a sufficient distance to manage the conditions. And he was wrong, because Joaquin's track shifted in the night, and by the time the error was clear, the ship was already committed to a course from which retreat was not straightforward. What the transcript captures, moving and terrible in equal measure, is the quality of human communication in extremis, the way people talk to each other when things are going badly but not yet catastrophically, the particular tone of concerned professionalism that gives way, eventually, to something rawer and more honest as the situation deteriorates beyond denial. There are moments in the transcript where crew members say things to each other that are clearly expressions of fear, of doubt, of the specific species of helplessness that comes from being on a large machine that is no longer responding to human control in the ways it should. And then there are other moments, and these are in some ways more difficult to read, where the professional discipline reasserts itself, where people pull back from the edge of panic and return to the language of procedure and protocol, because that language is what they have, and because abandoning it entirely means acknowledging what is becoming increasingly clear. Modern maritime search and rescue has improved enormously since the age of sail. The coordination centres that monitor emergency position indicating radio beacons, the aircraft that can reach locations hundreds of miles at sea, the vessels maintained specifically for rescue, operations, the satellite systems that can track ships continuously. All of these represent a genuine revolution in the safety of maritime travel. But the El Faro demonstrates that this revolution has limits. The Coast Guard response to the El Faro's distress call was rapid and professional. Aircraft were dispatched within hours. Surface vessels followed. The search was extensive and eventually recovered the voyage data recorder and some bodies and debris, but no one was saved. The ship had gone down in conditions that prevented the survival of the people in the water. The combination of the hurricane-force winds, the wave heights, and the temperature of the Atlantic produced a survival window measured in minutes, and rescue aircraft cannot reach the scene of a sinking in minutes. There is, in the maritime world, a concept called the survival craft, the life raft or lifeboat or survival suit that represents the last line of protection when a ship goes down. Modern survival craft are remarkable pieces of technology, self-inflating, thermally insulated, equipped with emergency rations and signalling equipment, designed to keep people alive in open water for days while rescue services locate them. But they depend on being deployed successfully, which depends on people being able to reach them and use them in conditions that may be preventing normal movement or preventing normal thinking. In a hurricane, reaching a life raft on the deck of a sinking ship requires navigating a surface that is simultaneously tilting, awash with seawater, and being struck by wind that can reach 100 miles an hour. The gap between the technology of survival and the conditions in which it must be used remains, in the worst scenarios, an unbridgeable distance. There is a particular quality to the feeling that comes when something lost returns, not restored, not repaired, not alive again, but simply found, located, given coordinates in the world of the present after decades or centuries of absence. The ships that sit at the bottom of the world's oceans are not simply wrecked machines. They are records, physical records of the moment of their loss, sometimes perfectly preserved by cold water and absence of oxygen, sometimes broken and scattered by currents and depth, and the patient processes of marine chemistry. When they are found, they become readable again. The story that ended so catastrophically, that left nothing behind but silence and speculation, can suddenly be reopened. The discovery of HMS Erebus in September of 2014 was, in the context of Arctic exploration history, something close to a miracle. The ship had been missing for 168 years. The broad outlines of what had happened to the Franklin expedition had been established by the mid-19th century. The ships had been trapped in ice, the crew had died, there had been no survivors, but the fate of the ships themselves had remained unknown, and with them the physical evidence that might answer the remaining questions about exactly how and when things had fallen apart. The Arctic Research Foundation and Parks Canada joint survey that found Erebus was using underwater remote sensing technology, multibeam sonar and remotely operated vehicle cameras that would have been science fiction to the Admiralty officers who had dispatched search parties in the 1850s and 1860s. But the more interesting part of the discovery was the role played by Inuit oral history. The Inuit people of the region, the Netsilik and other groups who had encountered the dying members of the Franklin expedition in the 1840s, and whose oral traditions had preserved detailed accounts of where the ships were seen, Where the bodies were found, where material from the expedition had been located, had been telling the same geographical story for over a century. Researchers who had been willing to take those accounts seriously had been looking in roughly the right area for years. The high technology that found the ship was guided, at least in part, by human memory. When the remotely operated vehicles first filmed Erebus sitting on the bottom in 11 meters of water, the images were strikingly poignant. The ship was largely intact. Its bell was still attached. One of its cannons was still in place. In subsequent diving expeditions, archaeologists found that the lower decks of the ship were remarkably well preserved, sealed by the cold water, protected from the processes that destroy wrecks in warmer, more biologically active seas. Personal artifacts belonging to individual crew members were found in their cabins, a tin of preserved mustard, unopened, medicine bottles still sealed, a writing desk with the drawer closed, the accumulated small objects of daily life on a ship that had, at some point between 1846 and the present day, settled quietly to the seafloor and become a time capsule. HMS Terror was found 2 years later in 2016 in an even more extraordinary state of preservation. The ship was sitting upright on the seafloor in Terror Bay, a bay that is named, one notes with some discomfort for the ship, with its hatches closed, its rigging largely intact, and its cargo still in the hold. The level of preservation was remarkable enough that researchers began to wonder whether the ship might have been sailed by some of its crew after the main party abandoned the expedition and marched south, whether a smaller group of survivors might have returned to one of the ships, refloated it from the ice that had imprisoned it, and sailed it to Terror Bay before it finally sank. This theory, still debated, would explain both the extraordinary preservation of the ship and certain details of the Inuit oral accounts that describe a ship being seen under some form of human control in the period after the main abandonment. The Mary Celeste, by contrast, has never been found, or rather has been found and lost again. The wreck of the ship that was run aground on the Haitian Reef in 1885 was located by a documentary filmmaker in 2001, but the identification was contested and the site has not been conclusively verified. The ship that sailed unmanned through the Atlantic in 1872 seems, appropriately, to have managed to remain mysterious even in its destruction. The Carol A. Deering, whose crew vanished so completely from her decks in 1921, was salvaged after her discovery, or rather, the attempt to salvage her was abandoned because the Diamond Shoals made the operation too dangerous, and she broke up on the shoals in a storm. Her physical remains are gone. The mystery of her crew remains entirely unresolved. The American government investigation that examined the case for more than a year, in 1921 and 1922, produced a final report that is a masterpiece of bureaucratic inconclusiveness, cataloguing every theory that had been proposed and then noting, methodically, the evidence that undermined each of them. The crew of the Carol A. Deering walked off that ship and into the water and the wind and simply ceased to exist, as completely as if they had never been born. The Derbyshire was found in 1994 by a joint Japanese-British survey and subsequently relocated and examined in exhaustive detail by a British government investigation. The wreck lies in more than 13,000 feet of water in the Pacific, and the investigation of it, involving specialised underwater vehicles and decades of forensic analysis, was the longest and most expensive maritime investigation in British history. It ultimately changed British and international maritime law, leading to significant revisions in the structural requirements for bulk carrier ships. 44 people died so that the rules could be changed. This is, in a sense, what maritime disaster investigations do. They convert loss into learning, they extract some form of future protection from present catastrophe. But the arithmetic of it is always troubling. The knowledge costs the lives, and the lives are already gone. The technology that found Erebus and Terror, multi-beam sonar, side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras and manipulator arms, represents a revolution in underwater archaeology that has been unfolding for the past 4 decades. The wreck of the Titanic, found in 1985 by Robert Ballard and a Franco-American team, demonstrated for the first time what was possible when modern deep-sea technology was applied systematically to the problem of finding specific objects on the ocean floor. Ballard's approach, using a towed camera sled to sweep large areas of seafloor, then directing a more capable vehicle to investigate promising contacts, has become the template for underwater survey operations that have since found hundreds of historically significant wrecks. The discovery of the Titanic was, in some ways, almost too easy. The ship was so large, in water that was deep but not extraordinarily deep, and had been sinking in relatively well-understood circumstances for 60 years when it was found. The challenge of finding smaller, older ships in deeper or more remote water is considerably greater, and the work that has been done since 1985 to develop the tools and techniques for those more demanding discoveries has required an investment of resources and ingenuity that is itself a significant chapter in the history of technology. The vehicles that found Erebus and Terror are descendants of the vehicles that found the Titanic, refined through decades of engineering improvements, tested in hundreds of expeditions, guided by navigational systems of a precision that would have seemed magical to anyone who lived before the satellite era. But the underwater archaeology that these vehicles make possible is not simply a technical exercise. It is a form of historical recovery, the recovery of physical evidence from events that happened before living memory, events that left incomplete records, events whose full story cannot be reconstructed from documents alone. The artifacts that come up from a wreck, the buttons, the crockery, the tools, the personal possessions of people who lived and died in events that we know about only from written accounts, are not merely interesting curiosities. They are testimony. They are, in many cases, the only testimony we will ever have from the people who were there, because the people who were there did not survive to give any other kind. When the archaeologists working on the Erebus site found, in one of the ship's lower compartments, a collection of personal items that included a pocket watch, a pair of spectacles, and a small leather notebook, they were finding things that had last been touched by a specific human being, a member of the expedition, a man who had boarded the ship in England in May of 1845 and who had died of cold, of disease, of lead poisoning, of starvation, somewhere in the Canadian Arctic in circumstances that no one will ever fully reconstruct. The pocket watch still existed. The man who had carried it was gone. And between those two facts, the persistence of the object and the absence of the person, lies something very close to the fundamental condition of historical knowledge. We have the things and we have the words, but the people are always, finally, beyond reach. The ocean's relationship with human memory is a complex and often cruel one. It takes things and keeps them, and it returns them on its own schedule and in its own condition. Wooden ships dissolve over centuries, consumed by the teredo worm, the shipworm, a marine bivalve mollusk that can bore through hardwood at a rate of an inch per month, and by the fungi and bacteria that attack organic material in seawater. Iron and steel ships rust, their plates growing thinner over decades until they collapse under their own weight. Even the most protected wrecks in the coldest and deepest water are changed by their time on the seafloor in ways that make them both more and less than what they were. More, because time has given them a patina that transforms them into something between artifact and monument. Less, because the people who made them and sailed them and died on them are gone, and the ship without the people is only a shape, only an outline, only the container from which the essential thing has been removed. When divers first entered the interior of HMS Terror, they found the ship in a state of preservation so extraordinary that it seemed almost impossible. Windows intact, the glass unbroken, cabinets with their doors still closed, personal belongings still in place on shelves as if the occupants had only just stepped out. The combination of cold water, low oxygen, and the ship's rapid sinking had created conditions that preserved everything at once: the ship, the objects within it, and the frozen record of the moment of abandonment. Archaeologists working in the wreck described the experience as profoundly disorienting. The feeling of moving through a space that had been sealed in 1848, that had been waiting in total darkness and absolute cold for someone to open it, that was now being opened, slowly and carefully, by people who understood what it meant but could not fully protect themselves against the emotional force of it. This is what the sea keeps, and what it eventually sometimes returns. Not the people. The people are long beyond any possibility of return, but the spaces they inhabited, the objects they used, the traces of their presence in the world, these things the sea has kept in its deep cold lockers against the possibility of someone coming to look, and when someone comes to look, the silence of those spaces does something to the people who enter them, that no amount of historical documentation can quite replicate. It makes the past present. It makes the dead, briefly, partially, incompletely real again. It makes the distance between 1848 and the present day seem, for a moment, bridgeable. There is something that all of these stories share, something beneath the specific details of ice and fire and plague and mutiny and calm, something that connects the crew of the Cospatrick dying on the dark Southern Ocean in 1874 with the men and women of the El Faro going down in the Bahamas in 2015, something that connects Captain Briggs setting his wife's sewing kit on the table of the Mary Celeste in November of 1872, with Captain Crozier writing his last entry in the expedition log on King William Island in April of 1848. What they share is the condition of being small and human, and caught by a world that is larger than human planning can account for, by forces that do not recognize the authority of either individual courage or institutional competence, by the sheer implacable scale of an ocean that does not care. The sea does not hate the ships that cross it. This is important to understand. The sea does not wish them harm. It is simply indifferent, and indifference, at that scale, the indifference of an environment covering 70% of the planet's surface, moving according to laws of physics and chemistry and atmospheric dynamics that are older than life itself, is the most devastating force that human beings have ever tried to navigate. The sailors who mastered it, or who came close to mastering it, did so not by overcoming that indifference but by reading it, understanding it, learning its patterns and its moods and its characteristic treacheries as intimately as any person knows another person, and then moving through it with the particular combination of skill and humility and luck that maritime survival has always required. When they failed, when the ice closed in, or the wind died, or the fire caught, or the disease spread, or the hull failed, or the judgment was simply wrong, they were left with whatever was inside them. The stories that survived the disasters are not mostly stories of heroism in the conventional sense. They are stories of human beings doing the best they could with what they had, in circumstances that were beyond their control, far from any witness. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. Sometimes the record is simply silence. No survivors, no log, no wreckage, nothing but the blank space in the shipping ledger where the ship's name and expected arrival date are written, and then a line, and then nothing. The ocean has been accepting those blank spaces for as long as human beings have been crossing it. It does not give them back, most of them. Erebus and Terror came back eventually after 170 years, returned not in triumph, but in the cold patience of archaeological investigation, their brass bells and closed drawers and unopened tins of mustard testifying to the ordinary daily life that had continued right up until the extraordinary final silence. The Mary Celeste remains open, her crew gone into the Atlantic in the years, the Carol A. Deering's 11 men are simply absent, as completely as if the sea had decided that they belong to it. For those who have spent time with these stories, really spent time with them, not in the mode of seeking the sensational solution or the satisfying explanation, but in the mode of sitting with what is actually known and what remains permanently unknown, there is a particular quality to the feeling they leave behind. It is not fear, exactly. It is not sadness, exactly. It is something closer to awe, the awe of encountering a scale of indifference so vast and so complete that it reduces all the complexity of human life to a single, simple condition. A small vessel surrounded by deep water, very far from shore. The ships are out there now, the ones that were lost and the ones that found their way home. They are all in the end part of the same ocean, the ocean that received them and kept them, and occasionally, in the age of sonar and remotely operated vehicles and patient historical detective work, gives one of them back, not restored, not explained, just found, located. Given back their coordinates in the world of the present, their silence broken momentarily by the lights of a remotely operated camera moving through the cold and the dark, illuminating a bell that has not rung for 170 years, a drawer that no one has opened since the last hand that closed it. All the water in the world, and somewhere beneath it, all the ships that never came home. The sea crossings that defined the modern world were not undertaken by people who were indifferent to danger. They were undertaken by people who understood the danger, who had heard the stories and read the logs and known men who had not come back, and who went anyway, because poverty drove them, or ambition drove them, or duty drove them, or the particular restlessness that some people carry inside them from birth, and that the land with all its familiar horizons cannot satisfy. The history of maritime disaster is also, necessarily, the history of maritime courage. Not the courage of people who did not know the risks, but the courage of people who knew them exactly and went out to meet them anyway, because the sea was where the world's work was done and they had decided to be part of it. What survives of these people is fragmentary and partial. A log entry here, a letter there, a survivor's testimony taken down by a port official or a naval inquiry board, an account published years after the fact by a man who had time to shape his memories into a narrative, and who inevitably shaped them into a form that said something about who he wished he had been as well as who he actually was. The honest maritime memoir is rare, because honesty about what happens to people under extreme stress, honesty about fear, about the failure of judgment, about the things done and not done when all the normal rules of behaviour have been suspended by catastrophe, requires a kind of self-accounting that most people find deeply uncomfortable. The men who survived the Cospatrick told the officers of the Scindia what had happened in the boats. Some of what they said was recorded. Some of it, one suspects, was not. The historians who come after are always working with the version of events that the survivors chose to leave behind, and that is never quite the same thing as the events themselves. The ocean does not discriminate between the famous and the obscure. The same cold water that took the crew of HMS Erebus and Terror, officers and gentlemen, explorers celebrated in the newspapers of the day, men whose names were known in the drawing rooms of London, also took the nameless sailors of the thousands of ships that crossed and sank and left no record at all. The maritime archives of the great trading nations are full of entries that read, simply, that such and such a ship was expected in port on such and such a date, and did not arrive, and was not subsequently heard from. No survivors, no wreckage, no log, nothing. Just the absence where a ship used to be. These are the stories that history has not kept, because history keeps what evidence keeps, and the evidence, in these cases, is a blank. And yet those blank spaces are part of the story too. They are the part of the story that the sea claimed entirely, that was never returned, not in documents, and not in wreckage, and not in the cold-preserved artefacts of an extraordinary archaeological site. They are the part that belongs permanently to the deep water, the part that will never be recovered no matter how sophisticated the technology becomes, because the ships are gone and the people are gone, and the only record that they existed is the white space on a page in an archive where someone wrote a ship's name and a departure date, and then stopped writing. The white space is the sea's answer. It is the same answer it has always given to the question of what happened to the people it took. It is the sound of water on a hull late at night, very far from anywhere, when the wind is low and the stars are bright and the world is reduced to the small circle of the ship, and everything outside it is dark and quiet and impossibly, immeasurably deep.